Hello again. I have run through the list of all the major colonial powers, explaining their early efforts and colonial wars against the natives and each other. However, the picture would not be complete without talking about slavery and the slave trade, which is often portrayed as a white conspiracy against colored people, but that's an overly simplistic and biased explanation. As we will see in this video, slavery was nothing new or special when the Atlantic slave trade commenced. Slavery was practiced in ancient Egypt and in Ptolemaic Egypt as well. In Roman times, slaves were brought through the desert to North Africa. This persisted in these Christian communities even after the fall of the empire. The arrival and expansion of Islam did not change the situation, although as we got closer to 1000 AD, the direction turned around as Iberian Jews and Vikings transported Christian and pagan Europeans to the markets of Toledo and Baghdad. The Catholic Church prohibited the export of slaves to non-Christian lands, but this did not stop the lucrative business. As an interesting side note, the Mamluks were a group of slave soldiers who became the ruling class in Egypt in the 13th century, but it is perhaps more important that between the 16th and 19th centuries, the Barbary pirates sold more than 1 million Europeans in North Africa and the Ottoman Empire. This was an equal opportunity business. In Central Africa, the Kingdom of Congo also utilized slaves and relied on the slave trade partly to improve the economy, but also to populate their own villages. Before the Europeans showed up, most slaves were war captives. In East Africa, a small-scale slave trade developed with Persia, China, and India, although gold and ivory were the primary goods. A few centuries later, the Christian kings of Ethiopia and the Muslim Adal Sultanate both traded slaves, mostly those who were captured inland. In West Africa, slavery became important with the development of the Trans-Saharan route and the rise of the Ghana, Mali, and Songhai empires, which relied on locally produced gold. With the emergence of the Atlantic slave trade, this region became an important source. Already by the 16th century, 1/3 of the population was enslaved by these early Islamic states. The first Europeans to show up on the coast of West Africa were the Portuguese. They were originally interested in gold and spices, but soon discovered that some nearby islands were perfect for sugar plantations. These required lots of cheap labor, so the first slaves were purchased and a castle was built on the Gold Coast in 1482 to control the gold and slave trade. The Spanish were the first to transport African slaves to the Americas, to the islands of Cuba and Hispaniola, mainly to replace the natives who were wiped out by diseases. Despite the occasional violence between European and African forces, this was mostly peaceful trading, as several West African states were interested in the expansion of the slave trade, from which they could profit through direct selling and customs fees. Here we arrive at the popular image of the transatlantic slave trade, with evil Europeans kidnapping innocent Africans and transporting them to America for huge profits. In reality, in most cases, Europeans did not participate in the collection of slaves in Africa due to their fear of malaria. Instead, local powers like the Bono state, the Oyo Empire, the Kong Empire, and the Kingdom of Dahomey were responsible for the collection and transfer of new slaves, who were often free people condemned for minor infractions. These men and women were then sent to the coast, where European traders purchased them to satisfy the increasing demand for labor. It may have been an unequal relationship, but both sides profited from the trade. Europeans were also used to settle regional disputes between African powers, but removing them from newly conquered territories was almost impossible. The Treaty of Tordesillas did not allow Spanish ships in African ports, but the union with Portugal in 1580 changed that. By that time, slaves were being transported to Brazil, although Mexico became the largest single market. Spain first relied on Portuguese ships, then it granted Genovese merchant banks the license to trade slaves to their colonies, and after their union fell apart in 1640, It prohibited Portugal from being directly involved. In the early 1600s, the English and the Dutch were trying to get involved. They established their first American colonies and engaged in sugar production. The first period was over. In the second, English, Dutch, and French ships increased the flow of trade. After 1650, the main destinations were small Caribbean islands with their slave-dependent economies. After a period of Dutch dominance, the English soon became the primary traders. They sold slaves in Jamaica to all interested parties, even the Spanish. Most slaves were from West Africa, but in the 18th century, Angola became the primary source. This is the period in which half of all slaves were transported to the Americas, mostly by British, French, and Portuguese traders, before the British and US ban on African slave trade that was implemented in 1807. Still, in the first half of the 19th century, another 3.5 million slaves were transported. Over time, chattel slavery became the most common form, in which slaves were treated as property. Their children were also retained by the master. In the transatlantic version, a triangular trade developed, in which European goods, guns, ammunition, alcohol, textiles, etc., were sold in Africa in return for slaves, who were transported to the Americas, from where cotton, sugar, tobacco, molasses, and rum were shipped to Europe. At the same time, some African communities moved away from the coast to avoid being enslaved, while the African elites sent their children to Europe to be educated. European slave trade in the Indian Ocean began in the early 1500s with Portuguese traders. Slaves from Mozambique were transported to India and Asia, but the establishment of the Dutch East India Company in the early 1600s resulted in a huge increase and the inclusion of Ceylon and other Dutch colonies. Indian and Chinese traders shipped around 250,000 slaves to Dutch Indonesia between 1500 and 1700. The East India Company was also heavily involved, while the French established colonies on Réunion and Mauritius in 1721, bringing slaves to these islands. Overall, more than 500,000 slaves were exported to this region until 1850, and a similar number ended up in the Americas through the Indian Ocean. In comparison, roughly 12 million slaves were exported across the Atlantic. Most of these, almost 5 million, arrived in Brazil, but the Caribbean islands received almost 4 million of them, while Spanish America had 1.3 million, and North America had to contend with only 400,000. Slavery and the slave trade were often condemned, even early on, by religious figures and later by politicians and activists. As it usually happens, such denunciations were part of a wider plot to justify current practices. For example, in the 1700s, European writers claimed that slavery in Africa was brutal, therefore the slaves had to be transported elsewhere, like the Americas. Later on, similar arguments were made to justify the process of colonization and the conquest of Africa, purportedly to end the practice of slavery there. We all know how that turned out. Even though European powers gradually banned slavery and the slave trade, it remained part of everyday life in Africa and elsewhere. In the end, the slave trade was first and foremost a business opportunity, which offered huge profits. Race and religion were not important factors. Those who could, Europeans, Africans, and Asians, profited from it, while their less fortunate counterparts suffered because of it. This is the never-ending story of mankind. Thank you for watching. See you next time.